Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back, everyone. We have Dr. Sean Beinberg back with us, and we're looking at Federalist Papers that, maybe if you're looking through a high school curriculum, maybe aren't as well known, but they're still very important. So the ones we're looking at today have to deal with separation of power. So Dr. Beienberg, today we're looking at Federalist 47 and 48. Can you tell us what those are about?
Sure. I think these are two of the most important Federalist Papers. I would say maybe certainly of the top 10, maybe the top 5. Along with Federalist 70, which sort of lays out the logic of executive power. I think they give you the best understanding of separation of powers. 47 and 48 are concentrating more on the logic of separation of powers and what it means in the American political system and why the Constitution is desirable. It's worth emphasizing that in these Federalist Papers, Madison actually points out and says a lot of people are complaining that this system has a poor separation of powers. And he says, if they were correct about that, then everybody should oppose this Constitution. Because he says a proper functioning of a separation of powers is so essential to good governance. But he goes on to say, but it turns out they're wrong, that in fact the separation of powers designed in these two Federalist Papers is in fact really sophisticated and thoughtful and reflects, to use the modern consultant's term, best practices, as well as the logic of Montesquieu. It's hard to overstate how important Montesquieu is politically to these folks at the time. The Bible is the text that they cite the most politically. Montesquieu is second. So Montesquieu is basically their political Bible. And so Madison starts by agreeing with the critics and Montesquieu when he says the concentration of the different powers, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, in a single hand, but that's an important sort of asterisk there, would be the very definition of tyranny. But then what's interesting is he walks through and says, okay, what would it mean to be, what would this despotism, what would this tyranny look like? And he says actually quite strikingly that it can be in one hand or a few hands or many hands. Right. So the sort of classic example of a tyranny we think of is sort of a military dictator with a gun pointing at. But he says, no, it could be actually a small group like an oligarchy. But strikingly, he also says it could be many hands. An entire large government could be a tyranny. And then he says, and the way that it is chosen also, in a sense, is agnostic to tyranny. It could be hereditary. It could have seized power by force, but it also could have been elected. So if you think through the logic here, Madison says a tyranny can be both many hands and elected, which is to say that a popularly elected republic or democracy, according to Madison, can itself still be a tyranny. It's not about the number necessarily of people who are invested in governing authority, not how they got it. He says actually the more dangerous way to think of tyranny is if they can do multiple things at once. That is to say, they don't have checks on their authority or power is not decentralized in a meaningful way. And so he says the core of this we think of as the promotion of liberty and the prevention of tyranny. And so what he does in Federalist 47 and 48 is he walks through and says, basically, we all agree separation of powers is good. And then he says, okay, well, let's look at Montesquieu. Montesquieu doesn't say that separation of powers needs to be completely divided in the sense that no branch has an influence over the other. That's the critique that's getting raised against the Constitution, is that there's a little bit of mixing of powers. And I'll spare the listeners. If you want to go back and read the text itself, it's quite good, but his sentences are kind of long and would be hard to sort of read here. But he effectively says, Montesquieu agrees with me on this, and he does a reading of Montesquieu. He says, everybody recognizes that Montesquieu worshipped England as the model vision of the separation of powers. And he points to the state constitutions. And he says, effectively in all of them, we see a mixing of the separation of powers in the sense that the legislature has a little bit of executive power. So the Senate has to consent to treaties, right? That is part of the executive power on the foreign policy side. Conversely, the executive has a little bit of legislative power. It has a veto. And he walks through examples of how that plays out. But he says, look, we see this in England. We see this in the state constitutions. He says some of the state constitutions have this really, really robust language saying separation of powers shall be purely and perfectly and always observed. And then he goes through and says, but actually, if you look at the way they operate, it doesn't work that way. He says the better ones are the ones like the Massachusetts Constitution. And remember that the founders view the Massachusetts Constitution, which is mostly John Adams's handiwork, as the model that the U.S. Constitution is. The Pennsylvania one is the one they don't like, and Madison is explicitly critical of that in these Federalist Papers, that it has really weak separation of powers, and therefore is effectively tyrannical. So he says, look, even in the examples, we always have mixing of powers. And he says, okay, well, why is that a good thing? And this is where he spells out a really subtle argument. In popular conversation, we think of the terms separation of powers and checks and balances as interchangeable, but they're not. Separation of powers under Montesquieu, under Madison, means no branch can do basically a second branch's job. The legislature can't execute the law. The executive can't adjudicate the law. So nobody gets to do two things. So that's separation of powers. Checks and balances is the piece where there's a little bit of blending, where each of them has a little bit of a veto point or a block of the other ones. And Madison says, and this is actually a really great way to make sure that the separation of powers is protected, because otherwise one branch could just start doing another branch's job. And he said, this is where the famous line about parchment barriers comes from, which is something that he actually pulls from, quoting by name Thomas Jefferson and the Notes on the State of Virginia, where Jefferson says, look, if we look at the Virginia Constitution and some other ones in history, there haven't been barriers to stop the branches from interfering with each other. You can write on a list, this branch shouldn't do this, but unless you give them an actual operational tool to block what another branch is doing, they will inevitably take power from the others. And so, as my former colleague, Zach German used to say, the real paradox, and from Madison, this is Federalist 48, is unless the departments be so far connected and blended as to give each a constitutional control over the others, the degree of separation which the maxim requires can never in practice be duly maintained. So the irony, he says, the paradox is you must mix the powers in order to keep them separate. You must give the executive the ability to block legislation. Otherwise, the legislature could pass laws that would screw with the executive's ability to enforce the law. You must give the executive a pardon. The pardoning power is quintessentially executive, but in a way it borders on dealing with sort of cases and like you have to basically give them a little bit of a control of each other. And so you give them each a veto to block things the other one does, but none of them get to affirmatively do things the other one does. That's the paradox, and that's the subtle distinction between the separation of powers and checks and balances. So 47 and 48 are laying out that part.
So if I'm teaching this to a class, do you think that the best way to do this would be to pair both of those Federalist Papers together as opposed to just teaching one or the other?
Yeah, they are so deeply linked to one another. I think they're effectively inextricable. What you could do is what I do in my introductory classes is I have the students skip this. This wounds me as a state constitution scholar, but I just have them skip when Madison goes into the real heavy detail of the operations of the state constitutions. And if you do that, they're only like 2 or 3 pages each. They're pretty short if you take out the sort of exhaustive detail. Now, it's good that Madison does that because he's writing to an audience that keeps saying, we love our states. We love our state constitutions. And so you can see him saying, aha, checkmate. Like there's actually more robust separation of powers in this than the state constitutions that you're fawning over here. So, yeah, I think that the two of them are effectively inseparable. I do think there's one other thing that's worth adding here, because there's a line from Federalist 48 while we're talking about the context of state constitutions that often gets misinterpreted. So Madison has the very famous line where he says, the legislature is basically everywhere a vortex. It's always the one that sucks power to itself. And so this has often been treated as Madison is scared of legislative power. He's okay with executive power. But Madison is talking about a specific moment in time when, in the wake of the American Revolution, remember, the legislatures had been elected by the people. That's what they liked. That was what they wanted to have most political power. The governors were generally royally appointed, and they didn't like the governors. So the earliest state constitutions make the governors extremely weak as a result. The Pennsylvania Constitution effectively dissolves a governor. There's this really, really weak nominal figure. And Madison says, everywhere that we're looking around, we can see right now the legislature is taking power, because that's how they built the constitutions, as an overreaction, or not necessarily an overreaction, but a reaction to the American Revolution. But what he says is, let's be cautious, though, and not overreact the other way and assume that the legislature will always be doing right. That, in fact, going back to Federalist 47 and Montesquieu, an elected multiple-person government can still be tyrannical. But he does go through in Federalist 48, and this is something people often skip over, but he says, there are scenarios when, in fact, you would be concerned about executive power. He says, executive power, quintessentially, like the power to execute the law, that's pretty limited. But he says, if you had a scenario where the executive isn't limited to that, where the executive has a mandate of popular support behind it, which again, which he thinks the legislators will have, and he says, and if your legislature is actually aggressive about power, those are the scenarios where your executive will be weak. But if your executive is doing non-executive things that can claim a popular mandate, and if you have a weak legislature, by Madison's rubric, you actually do need to fear executive power, right? And so I think one of the things that we certainly have seen in the last, 2/3 of a century is the executive is doing more lawmaking, is claiming more and more of a mandate. This is since Woodrow Wilson, particularly Theodore Roosevelt, and a legislature that gives power away, right? So I just think it's worth pausing and saying Madison is actually really subtle and really smart here in Federalist 48 in a way that I think is often ignored, where he said he gives you a rubric of when you should be afraid of executive power. And I think it's fair to say that most of those metrics actually look more like contemporary politics than the universe he's inhabiting, which is one where the governors are weak and disempowered because everybody hates them, because they have the strong memory of the American Revolution. And so that's not necessarily the same historical moment we're under. So this is, again, one of the places where the Federalist Papers are actually really keen in their understanding of institutional dynamics and the nature of politics, but they're describing a historical universe that exists then, but they're giving you the logic to think through politics more broadly.
Dr. Beinberg, thank you so much. And you talked a lot about Montesquieu. We have a podcast on Montesquieu that I will link in the show notes, but thank you for your expertise in Federalist 47 and 48, and an extra shout out to Dr. Zach German.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.